It's 2025, and we live in a world of increasing uncertainty. And if you're an import gamer, the uncertainty with which you are faced is the question of tariffs. And how will tariffs, and again, I'm speaking from the perspective of the United States, how will the Trump tariffs affect import gamers? I think import gaming has always had a dual meaning. You have the actual act of importing physical games. And of course, that's what this channel has largely focused on. That's what the Nights On, Lights Off podcast has focused on. But there's also this idea of enjoying cultural imports. Once you get the physical game, I think the essence of being a retro gamer is enjoying that cultural artifact that you imported, the mindset behind it, the cultural assumptions behind it, and having an experience that really was not meant for you. There's always this transgression of cultural boundaries. And I think that's really at the heart of import gaming. I've said before that import gaming is as much a state of mind as it is an activity. And I think we lose sight of that. I'm certainly guilty on this channel and then also on the podcast of focusing a lot on buying. What are we buying? What are we importing? And I think social media platforms like YouTube and all the others, they kind of force people into a mindset of hyperconsumption. And we all sort of feed into that. But if these tariffs actually happen, and if we are forced into a world where these activities become way more expensive, I think we're going to have to move away from hyperconsumption and actually focus on the cultural aspect of importing and import gaming as a mindset. But before we get to that, I think it's instructive to look at what might actually happen with the tariffs. So I did a little quick math on what would happen if the tariffs actually were put in place. Now, depending on what you read and where you go, there's, I think, about 3 different tariff rates that have been thrown around. You have the 60% tariff that Trump said he was going to levy against China, the 20 to 25% tariff that he would levy against Canada, Mexico, and the rest of the world. And then more recently, he's talked about a 10% tariff on China. Now, scary as that may sound, I thought we could look at these tariff rates with reference to 3 common price points. I went with $39.99, or about 6,200 yen, which I think is a kind of a common price for a lot of the mid-range titles that you might be importing. Sort of smaller market releases. Obviously, there's some that kind of hit the $8,000 or $9,000 price point, but I think 6,000 is kind of a reasonable range. And then the standard game price of $59.99, and I went with the last price I saw of the Wii OLED at $350. Now, if you look at these tariff rates, I mean, is it really that bad? Are these tariffs going to be incredibly destructive to our hobby? I mean, I don't want to downplay it. This is more money, but if you're importing a $40 game and it becomes a $44 game or a $48 game, I don't know that that's so bad if it's a game that you really want to play. Now, if we hit that 60% tariff rate, now we're kind of going into dangerous territory, but I think by and large, at least with the Switch, a lot of the games themselves are made in Japan, so I don't know that we're going to hit that 60% tariff rate, but it would be possible, say, on a Switch 2, if the Switch 2 is manufactured in China, and then we're looking at a jump from $350, and again, we don't know the price of the Switch 2, it's presumably going to be more expensive than that, but we're going from $350 to almost $560. That's pretty significant. So again, I don't really want to downplay this, but I think importing things, let's say, from 2,000 to 8,000 yen is not in and of itself going to be that crazy. So that's the positive. If you're a fan of the tariffs, well, they're going to have their effect and you can still import. If you're not a fan of the tariffs, it's still not the end of the world. You may have your political objections, but I think, like I said, a price increase from $40 to $48 is not absolutely insane. But of course, if you're importing a lot, these costs are going to add up. It's more money out of your pocket. And then I think for those of us who have our sources in Japan, some of those smaller stores, or if you're having a friend send things to you, I mean, they are not going to pay the tariffs. The tariffs will have to be paid by you. So I think this creates another layer of complexity, and even if not complexity, just waiting as your package is held, and then you're going to have to pay your carrier. So I think it's going to extend delivery times and just create another thing that you have to do. And another thing that you also have to think about, and it's already happened, earlier this month, DHL announced a 30% price increase on shipping from Japan and I believe the rest of the world to the United States. Now, DHL is often a preferred carrier when you're doing importing. So if you take that 30% price increase, and even if it's a 10% tariff that you're going to have to pay one way or another, pretty significant, pretty expensive, even if it's not an absolute barrier to consumption. So if the hobby is indeed getting more expensive and we just can't spend at these rates, I mean, let's face it, life is getting more expensive. So when you add, let's just say 40%, 10% tariff, 30% increased shipping costs, you may have to cut back. But again, I don't think cutting back on your actual import spending makes you any less of an import gamer. In fact, I would argue this is an opportunity to really deepen your love of this hobby. So I've got 5 tips on how you can do that. So tip number 1 is to emulate while you still can. There are an absolute abundance of Japan-only games and across all platforms, and these games have rarely been explored, and they are currently out there. There are many databases on the internet where you can find entire collections for just about every system, from even before the NES, but certainly the NES, right through to the PlayStation 2, even the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. So as you're looking through these lists and these collections, find the Japan-only games, download them, try them out, see what these games are. And I think now it's even easier to do that because technologies like Google Lens and AI chatbots just makes translating these games much easier. And, in the past, you would get to a point and progress would just be impossible. There were language barriers that could not be overcome. That has completely changed. And as these technologies get better and better, it won't just be the fact that you're holding your phone up to the screen and getting that instant translation. You might actually see this ability built into TVs and other devices. And if that happens, there will be an untold number of retro import games that will be playable for the first time. But I think you have to grab those ROMs while you can. The emulation community is under assault, primarily by Nintendo, and just generally, digital content is being controlled by corporations who will monetize your access to these items. So again, you can download whatever you want, but don't neglect those games. You'll find some gems. I'll give you one, which I always thought was interesting, was the Combini. It's basically a convenience store management simulation. So you can get it on the PlayStation 2. I believe it was on the PlayStation, on the Saturn. These ROMs are floating out there. You can actually play the game with some translation software on your phone. It's free, assuming you have a PC to play it, and it's just hours of fun. Another great option is Steam. Many of the niche, interesting releases that certainly I import from Japan on a monthly basis, a lot of the games that we've talked about on the podcast, these games are also available on Steam for much lower prices. Again, I'll give you an example. Take Platform 8. This is a game that I imported. I got the special edition, which gave me just a big box of every single poster in the game. Paid the shipping on that, included it in my monthly shipment from Japan. But you don't have to do that. You can play it on Steam. It's probably about $12, and I think during the Christmas Steam sale, I got it for maybe $3. I think this is a game that is unique. It's basically an anomaly detection simulator, so it's not thrilling. It's not going to keep you on the edge of your seat, but it is a faithful recreation of going through kind of the labyrinths that are certain Japanese train stations. And what if, in kind of a Kafkaesque, dreamlike state, you couldn't escape until you found a very little anomaly in a tunnel? Interesting game. This is the kind of game that I think makes import gaming such a rewarding hobby, but you don't have to pay the fees to import it. It's just there for you on Steam if you look for it. Another strategy that I think we don't focus on enough as import gamers, and certainly very valuable to those of you who want to get into this part of gaming, is look for the oddball English language releases that do make it over here but get almost no fanfare. They are a subset of games that you do not know exist, and I include myself in that collective you. I am always finding games, these are Japanese games that have been translated into English and released here in North America, and I've never heard of them. I don't know what they are, but they're floating around out there. How do you find them? I would say first do some deep searching on Amazon, and I always like to search by released in the last 90 days. There's that little button on the left-hand side. And just go through these games. You'll be shocked by what you find. Yes, there's a lot of shovelware. I mean, you'll have to go 6-7 pages deep, but you may find things that you didn't know existed. Again, just by way of an example, there are a lot of P-Cube visual novels that have been released here that you wouldn't think would have ever made their way to the United States. Are these games worth playing? I mean, that's a different question, but from a collecting standpoint, from the standpoint of someone who wants to play something that really wasn't designed for our eyes, it's really interesting. Another strategy that you can do is searching the individual websites of indie publishers, small publishers, and then also these different limited release or FOMO publishers. There's a website called SwitchLib. I'll link to it below. It's pretty good. If you go to their sort of homepage, they very much push limited run and super rare game stuff, but they also have just a database of every company that it has published or is currently publishing on the Switch, and you'll find things that you had no idea existed. This next tip is kind of self-evident, but I do think we overlook it, and that is play what you have. If you've been importing and collecting for a while, I mean, you likely have a massive backlog, or even if you don't have a huge backlog, you probably have a subset of games that you haven't played in years. And I think in times where money's getting tight, whether it's because of tariffs or anything else, exploring within your physical media collection is incredibly rewarding and can offer you hundreds of hours of free import gaming. You paid for these games years ago, and they're there. Play them. I was just going through my collection looking for something, and I found some of the first games that I ever imported from Japan for the PlayStation 2, King of Colosseum, Green and Red Disc, and it just kind of hit me like, I didn't really care for these games necessarily, but I never unlocked all that there was to do. And I think there was a functionality where you can, play through the different rosters on each disc, and then I think if you had 2 saves on the same memory card, it unlocked something in the game. I never figured out what that was. I could go back and explore that. And my 5th and final tip is to explore import gaming adjacent media. I think if you like import gaming and you subscribe to my argument that it's as much, if not more, of a mindset than it is an actual consumer act of purchasing and importing games. You're going to find other kinds of Japanese media interesting. And I think the two key ones here are manga and anime. And those were two things that certainly I know growing up. I mean, they were kind of in the background. I didn't pay too much attention to them. But today they are considerably cheaper, at least in digital form. And of course, if you purchase, like I was at a bookstore last night, and I guess if you want to actually buy physical manga, it's pretty pricey. But there are all sorts of manga and scanlation places floating around online. Anime is pretty cheap to stream. My suggestion here would be a website called Retro Crush. It's about $5 a month or $50 a year, and it basically streams primarily 80s and 90s anime. And I think that pairs well to importers from, like myself, from that era who weren't really focused on manga or anime and maybe missed certain things. So I discovered and actually watched the Orange Road anime a few years ago on Retro Crush. And of course, I'd heard about it. I didn't know what it was. I knew it was an anime that looked like pastel painting. And I watched it, and it was actually just a huge rush of 80s nostalgia. So that stuff is out there. And I think if we're kind of curtailing our spending and importing habits, you can kind of switch to that for little or no money and still exist within that import gaming mindset. So it's really not all about spending money. And in times where, again, money is tight, whether it's for the tariffs or for some other reason, you can still enjoy gaming, and you can still particularly enjoy import gaming, kind of lose yourself in this different cultural experience. So if we are hit with these tariffs, take this opportunity to deepen your passion in these ways, and I think it will be as good or even more fulfilling than constantly buying and importing titles from Japan.